Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Kaido Mikilu. The headlines. Officials in the southern Ukrainian city of Kryvyi say 112 houses have been flooded after Russian missiles hit a major reservoir dam nearby. UN Chief Antonio Guterres speaks with Russian President Vladimir Putin about grain deal and prisoners of war, says the end of war is far away. The Biden administration in discussions with United States Congress over new Russia measures. We'll begin the program with news from the southern Ukrainian city of Kryvyi, where officials say 112 houses have been flooded after Russian missiles hit a major reservoir dam nearby. The city head, Alexander Vilko, says residents of as many as 22 streets and 2 districts have been asked to evacuate. He added that overnight, 2 blasts were carried out to increase the water flow from the dam to the Inulets River, and the situation was now under control. President Volodymyr Zelensky, who was born in Kryvyi, described Russia as a terrorist state after Wednesday's strike on the Karachunivsky Reservoir. In a speech, Mr. Zelensky said the reservoir had no military value at all. As of this morning, Mr. Vilko said that water levels in the Inulets River had now dropped considerably and there were no casualties. However, Moscow has not publicly commented on the reported missile strikes. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres says he feels a peace deal to end the war in Ukraine is not close. He made this comment to reporters following a call he had earlier with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The diplomat said he discussed a variety of issues with Putin, including the grain deal and the possibility of Russian exports, but cautioned there are obstacles to the export of Russian food and fertilizers. The two also discussed prisoners of war, and Guterres quoted Putin as saying there will be no obstacles from Russia with regards to the panel conducting a fact-finding mission into last month's prison attack in the Russian-occupied region of eastern Ukraine.
Well, the last time I spoke with President Putin was this morning. That is the reason why I came late to the press conference. We had the opportunity to discuss the Black Sea Grain Initiative and its extension and expansion, possible expansion. There are, as you know, talks in relation to the possibility of Russian ammonia exports through the Black Sea, in line with the methodology that is run by the JCC, the Joint Coordination Committee. We have discussed the obstacles that still exist in relation to the exports of Russia food and fertilizers. And I have to say that we have now a dramatic situation in the world in fertilizers. We are risking to have a fertilizer market crunch, which means that we risk to have in 2022 real lack of food. So to remove the obstacles that still exist in relation to the export of Russian fertilizers is absolutely essential at the present moment. There is a very important dialogue between the UN and the Russian Federation, between the UN and Ukraine. And we are looking not only at maintaining the grain deal, but expanding it, namely in relation to, just to give an example, the possibility of having ammonia exports through the same channel from the Russian Federation, and the possibility of an extension in time of the grain deal. All this has been discussed, and I am hopeful that we will be able to maintain a very important contribution to the dramatic situation of food security in the world. And as I mentioned, that if we are able, and we are totally committed to it, to remove the obstacles that still exist in relation to the Russian exports of fertilizers, that we will be able to normalize the fertilizer market and allow for the cultivation for next year to take place at the usual levels.
Well, elsewhere, U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price says the Biden administration is discussing with Congress analogous measures to impose on Russia in place of those carried by state sponsorship of terrorism designation. Mr. Price told a news briefing, noting President Joe Biden's recent statements that he will not approve designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on the West to label Russia a terrorist state, citing several deadly attacks on facilities like shopping centers and railway stations that killed numerous civilians.
The SST statute, the state sponsor of terrorism statute, of course, as a statute, as a law, it was written by Congress, drafted by Congress. It is our charge, as is always the case, to examine the facts and to apply that to the law that was drafted by Congress. But there's also the unintended consequences that could come with designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. We believe that there are more targeted approaches that we could take that would hold the Russian economy and the Russian government to account, to continue to impose those massive costs and consequences without incurring those unintended consequences. We have heard from humanitarian organizations, we have heard from NGOs of their sincere and profound concerns that designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism would hinder their ability to deliver humanitarian assistance inside Ukraine, leaving aside what they could do inside Russia, or what they would want to do inside Russia. They have concerns that taking this step would hinder their ability to help the people of Ukraine, and that is something that we take very seriously. We also take very seriously the need to see food continue to leave from Ukrainian ports, to travel by Ukrainian rail. And we are mindful of the implications, intended or not, of potentially labeling Russia a state sponsor of terrorism, the implications they would have on the ability of the international community to take part in transactions that would see food, whether it ultimately starts in Russia or ultimately takes root, literally, in Ukraine, from getting to the region and well beyond. So to sum it up, there are steps that we have taken, and there are steps that we are discussing with Congress that we could take that would have effects that are analogous to those envisioned by the SST without those unintended consequences.
Can you just bring us up to date as to...
Well, news just in has it that President Vladimir Putin of Russia and the Chinese leader Xi Jinping have just arrived at Uzbekistan for that planned meeting. All eyes will definitely be on that one. I will bring you updates during the course of the program. But about the state of things on ground in Ukraine, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that towns and villages recaptured from Russian forces had been left in disrepair and that there was evidence of genocide against Ukrainians. Mr. Zelensky made the comments in his regular nightly address. The Russian forces suffered a stunning reversal this month after Ukrainian troops made a rapid armored thrust in Kharkiv region, forcing a rushed Russian withdrawal. Well, according to a statement from the president's press secretary, President Zelensky was involved in a minor car crash after his return to Kiev, but did not have any serious injuries.
The
Russian army remained in Kharkiv region for more than 5 months, and during this time, the occupiers did not even try to do something for the people. They only destroyed, only seized, only deported. They left devastated villages, and in some of them, there is not a single surviving house. Have left schools turned into garbage dumps, and ruined churches turned literally into lavatories. Our law enforcers are already receiving evidence of murder, torture, and abductions of people by the occupiers. What the world has seen in Bucha, what we have seen in the deoccupied territory of Chernihiv and Sumy regions, and what we are seeing now in the Kharkiv region is the evidence of genocide against Ukrainians. Evidence that Russia can bring nothing but genocide.
Nikita Yuferov, a deputy in Smolenskoye Municipal District in St. Petersburg, is not backing down from his calls for Russian President Vladimir Putin to resign, even after having to pay a fine in court for speaking out, with a threat of jail time coming next. Mr. Yuferov says he's doing it for his children, saying that he wants them to be able to speak their minds at demonstrations and protests. Well, after receiving support from some people, Yuferov said he believes public opinion is shifting as compared to when Russian President Vladimir Putin first attacked Ukraine. And German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says Russian President Vladimir Putin unfortunately does not seem to have realized yet that the decision to invade Ukraine is a mistake. Mr. Scholz was commenting on a phone call with Putin a day earlier. He said it was still important to emphasize to Putin that Russia had to withdraw from Ukraine. In the 90-minute phone call, Scholz urged Putin to find a diplomatic solution for the conflict in Ukraine based on a ceasefire and the complete withdrawal of Russian troops as soon as possible. He also reiterated that Germany will continue to consult with its EU partners on further arms shipments, telling reporters that Germany will not go it alone. German Defense Minister Christine Lambert also shared her thoughts about the ongoing Russian-Ukraine conflict, saying that it is too early to tell whether Ukraine's significant territorial advances in recent days has marked a turning point in the war. Speaking during an interview in Berlin, she said the situation was hard to assess, adding that it is definitely a remarkable success that will contribute to Russia's destabilization. While Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says his army has liberated around 8,000 square kilometers of territory so far this month. That's nearly equivalent to the island of Cyprus. Ms. Lambert says this proves that the Ukrainian forces are very well positioned tactically and that they're capable of repelling attacks in a way that not many had thought them capable of. Ukraine has been pushing Berlin for months to supply Kyiv with more heavy weapons and to start delivering modern Western tanks as well. A demand German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has repeatedly rejected. More stories now. Russia says it has conducted strikes on several Ukrainian military targets, while Ukraine claimed to have continued to advance in southern region yesterday, according to Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Igor Konashenkov. The special military operation continued in the past 24 hours as Russian aerospace forces, missile troops and artillery units conducted massive fire strikes on Ukrainian targets in Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kharkiv and Nikolaev regions. According to him, 8 Ukrainian tanks, 13 infantry fighting vehicles, 11 other armored vehicles were destroyed, and over 150 Ukrainian servicemen were killed during the process. Yesterday, the spokesperson for Ukraine's Southern Operational Command, Natalia Humenyuk, said that the counterattack operation in the country's southern region of Kherson was underway, and it is within the firepower range of the Ukrainian army. Well, let's get more insight on this. We're joined by David Stone, a professor of Russian Studies, Strategy and Policy Department at Naval War College. He joins us from Rhode Island. Thank you for joining us on the program. I'd like to start off with this planned meeting between President Putin and the leader of China, Xi Jinping. It looks like all eyes on this meeting, definitely. What are your expectations from that meeting?
It's very difficult to predict, though one of the things that's been striking in the last few days is the way in which Xi Jinping has endorsed Kazakhstan's territorial integrity. One of the things that Russian nationalists will often discuss is that northern Kazakhstan has a fairly sizable still Russian population. And when Xi Jinping endorsed Kazakhstan's territorial integrity, that seems to have been something of a message to Russia. Now, this is, again, all my personal opinion. I'm not speaking in any official capacity, but that suggests that Xi Jinping and China's support for Russia is not wholehearted. Certainly, the Chinese leadership cannot be pleased with how Russia's performance thus far in the war. So I imagine we'll see some sort of general statement of support for Russia, but I don't expect a lot of concrete Chinese actions in support of Russia. Again, we may be surprised, but I have not seen signs of full-throated Chinese support.
But in terms of optics, I mean, just looking at this meeting alone, I mean, do you think that will give some sort of pep in the steps of Russia in this war? I mean, just the optics, that is.
Certainly the fact that they are meeting and the fact that there'll be pictures of the two of them sitting down and talking will be some degree of support for Russia's position. But one of the things to look for will there be concrete evidence of Chinese steps to support Russia? What concrete will come out of this? And again, we could be surprised, but it's difficult for me to see why China would step in at this point. One of the things that we've been seeing in recent days, for example, is that Russia has gone to North Korea to buy ammunition. And the fact that they're going to North Korea and not to China itself is a signal that perhaps the Chinese are not full-throated defenders of the Russian position here.
And I note that statement you keep putting, the uncertainty. We could be surprised. And I'll just tie this to the statement made by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres about his meeting with President Putin. I mean, it looked like a lot of people predicted that. They saw, what was going to come out of it. The fact that he came out and said, well, it looks like this war is far from over. A downer, definitely, for a lot of people who had expected that perhaps peace is on the horizon. We're just a few days to the International Day of Peace, so we're hoping that some sort of peace will come out. So your response, at least your comments to that meeting, is that shocking for you as well? Were you hoping that this will be short-lived, after that meeting with the UN Secretary General?
Well, certainly we can always hope that the war will be over soon, but I don't see concrete reasons to expect that the war will be over soon. Certainly, Russia still occupies enormous chunks of Ukrainian territory, and Putin's government has shown no signs of recognizing just how badly the war has been going for them and the scale of their losses. You're starting to see grassroots Russians start to show their concerns about what has happened to Russia thus far. But until Vladimir Putin decides that he's had enough and does not want to spend more Russian lives in this war, it's hard to see how this ends quickly. Putin still seems to want to have some sort of gains out of this fight. The Ukrainians, particularly given their recent successes, don't seem in a mood to stop fighting anytime soon. So I don't see any objective reasons, anything that besides hope that the fighting will be over. Again, it would be very nice if the Russians were to decide that their attempt to take over Ukrainian territory was a mistake and would end, but nothing I've seen thus far suggests that's coming anytime soon.
You know, both sides claim victory from time to time. I mean, Ukraine recently claimed victory, reclaiming lots of its territory. Russia also claims victory from time to time. And I wonder for you, sitting back, watching all of this, because the world is watching and it's hard to really decipher what is going on, who's having the upper hand, who is right, who is wrong. I mean, that's like the classic question. How do you differentiate between the rhetorics and what is really going on ground? How do you really internalize who's winning, how much of this is rhetoric, how much of this is just propaganda and all of that? Is there a way to go around all of the information, for you at least?
Well, I think it is important to keep an objective mind, to look at multiple sources of evidence. And when you say that the question of right and wrong, one of the things to bear in mind, in terms of the moral question of right and wrong, Russia has invaded Ukraine, Ukraine has not invaded Russia. That's a fundamental point. In terms of how the war is going, now, certainly the Ukrainian government has presented evidence of major Russian losses. And they've not presented evidence of their own losses. And I would not expect them to. That it's not the job of the Ukrainian government to do the Russian government's job for it. One of the things that's been very striking in the last few days, though, with this Ukrainian offensive, you can't fake that Ukraine has gained an enormous amount of territory over the last week or so. You can't fake that Russian troops have retreated from thousands of square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. So that's simply objectively true. And for the Russians to do this, and for them after the fact to call it a reorganization or a withdrawal to redeploy, that is very clearly a Ukrainian victory. Now, it's a Ukrainian victory in part of the territory that Russia has occupied. There are still enormous parts of Ukraine that Russia continues to occupy. But that is clearly a Ukrainian victory and a Russian loss. Those territorial losses are not a manufacture of Ukrainian propaganda. They're really happening. And the question then becomes, What is their significance? What resources does Ukraine have to continue this offensive? What resources does Russia have to continue to hold on to the Ukrainian territory it has already occupied? But you are absolutely correct that we do need to be able to weigh multiple sources of information to try to get the best picture of developments on the ground and what's really happening.
And I think at this point for both governments, it's trying to get people on their side because there's also a war of perception and all of that. The Ukrainian government, the president particularly, has asked that Russia be designated a terrorist state. Now, the U.S. Is not really taking that on board, saying it's our decision to make, and we're not at that point right now. How do you see that playing out? Do you think that that will be a downer, definitely, for the Ukrainian government? Do you think it sends a message that we're not getting as much support as we ought to get from at least the U.S. government and perhaps allied nations?
So to designate Russia a terrorist state would be an important symbolic step. It's not as clear to me what it would mean in concrete material terms. And I certainly understand why the Ukrainian government would like that. Certainly, Russia has engaged in strikes on Ukrainian cities. Ukrainian civilians have died. We just saw yesterday that a dam in Ukraine was hit by Russian missiles and has flooded a territory downstream from a reservoir. And that sort of attack on civilian infrastructure is a war crime. And I absolutely understand why Ukraine would like Russia to be designated a terrorist state. I do think one of the things that the Biden administration is doing, and again, I'm not speaking officially here, this is by just my own opinion on the situation, is trying to maintain freedom of action, not to stop supporting Ukraine. I've seen no signs that the U.S. government's support for Ukraine is flagging or dying away in any way, but to maintain freedom of action for some eventual solution to this war. At some point, the war will be over with, and at some point, the two sides will have to come to some sort of solution and some sort of agreement. And maintaining freedom of action in order to make that happen becomes easier if you haven't taken steps like designated Russia officially a terrorist state. And so a free hand to do whatever it takes to achieve some eventual political solution, I think, is probably what's motivating the Biden government here.
We're just less than a week to the International Day of Peace, at least for the United Nations. It's on Wednesday, September the 21st. And, well, the UN Secretary General himself said that this war is far from over. This has become like a customary question, really, asking, what is the solution to this war? What should the parties be doing? I mean, that's if they want to end the war. So I'll just put it up again. Perhaps we can refresh the minds of those listening, maybe those in power. What is the solution to this war for you?
So Karl von Clausewitz, a German military theorist, wrote 2 centuries ago. And one of the things he said in regard to this International Day of Peace, he said that aggressors are always peace-loving because aggressors would always prefer that the country they're attacking simply stop resisting and give them what they want. And certainly, I'm sure Vladimir Putin in that sense is a friend of peace. He would like the Ukrainians to give him what he wants without fighting. But certainly they're not going to do that. How does this war end? And this is a really interesting and good question. The Ukrainian government and Zelensky have said repeatedly that the war ends when Ukraine gets its territory back and all of its territory. Not just what Russia has taken since February, but also what Russia took in 2014, the Donbass and Crimea. And that's a lot. That's a lot for Ukraine to do. That's a lot of territory, and that would take a lot for them to liberate that territory from Russian occupation. But that's what they've said they want. On the other hand, Putin's government has had demands that they are not backing down from. Now, in the beginning, Putin was talking about denazification and changing the Ukrainian government, and that seems to have dropped by the wayside. The Russians are no longer talking about denazification. But they do talk about things like wanting to defend the people of the Donbass. They do talk about wanting to make sure that Ukraine will never join NATO. And right now, there's no common ground between those two sides. And at this point, what seems to be happening clearly is that both sides are willing to risk settling this on the battlefield. They're not yet at a point where they see that their better choice is a negotiated settlement. They think, clearly, both sides think they can do better fighting than giving the opponent what the opponent wants. Now, at some point, that's going to change. This war cannot last forever. It could last for a very long time, but it cannot last forever. But at the moment, both sides have staked out positions that are not commensurate. The Ukrainians want their territory back. They were invaded, and they want that territory back, and they want their people back. And at the moment, they've said they're not settling for anything short of that. Whereas the Russian government still insists that their territory, like Crimea, like the Donbass, that it is not going to hand back to the Ukrainians. And it is insisting on changes to Ukrainian policy, like Ukraine never joining NATO. And given that, at least at the moment, I don't see a way for this to end in the short run. The two sides are simply nowhere close to each other in terms of an agreement to end the war.
As usual, never an easy solution or easy answer to that question. Let's wind down on this, this negotiation, at least for some sort of grain deal and the possibility of Russian exports, even for prisoners of war and the rest. Do you think that at least Russia is saying that we're open to, allow this fact-finding mission also take a look at what's been going on? Do you think that that's a step in good faith, maybe something that can be held on to and even pushed further if we're going to find a solution to this?
Certainly the deal from a few months ago to allow grain exports, to let Ukrainian grain flow out, is a good thing. It's a good thing for Ukraine. It's a good thing for the world. There's a lot of people around the world who depend on food coming out of Ukraine to eat. And so that was absolutely a positive step. And it thus far seems to more or less be holding that is actually working for the moment. And again, that's positive and that's good. It could end at any point. The nature of war is that it is unpredictable. I don't see a lot of room for further development of a deal like that. One of the issues that the Ukrainians have is that Russian attacks on infrastructure have made it a little difficult for Ukrainian grain to get harvested. We're approaching harvest season now. For Ukrainian grain to get harvested and make it to export ports. Certainly the Ukrainian government would like to see that food go out. It needs those export earnings. The people of Europe and the Middle East and Africa that depend on that food would like to see that come out. And again, it's good that it has not been interrupted thus far. And I wish I could be confident that an interruption won't happen in the future. But I do think we absolutely have to be prepared for that possibility.
Well, very, very interesting insight there. I would like to thank you so much, David Stone, who's a professor of Russian Studies Strategy and Policy Department, Naval War College. Thank you so much for your thoughts on the program.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Well, still to come on the program, Ukraine energy operator says Kharkiv region's electricity has been restored following Russian strike. That's at the moment. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us. Ukraine's energy supplier has said 2 of the main electricity lines supplying part of Kharkiv region have been restored following a Russian strike on a local facility that left many without power. According to repair crews of Ukrenergo, which operates the nation's high-voltage transmission lines, energy supply was restored across the Kharkiv region late on earlier in the week. The entire region of Kharkiv was without electricity after the backup power line supplying settlements failed. The deputy head of the office of the president of Ukraine, Kyrylo Tymoshenko, said, citing what he described as insidious shelling by Russian forces as a cause. Well, last week, Ukrainian forces ruptured Russian defenses and recaptured swathes of territory in the east. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia responded on Sunday with missile strikes that hit large parts of eastern Ukraine, including the Kharkiv power and heating plant, killing 1 employee and damaging critical infrastructure. We're joined now by David Otto. He is a director for Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies. Joins us live from our Abuja studio. Good morning. Thank you for joining us on the program. I'd like to start off with that breaking story, the meeting between Russian President and Chinese President Xi Jinping. And in terms of strategy now, this is coming off the reports of Russian losing at least parts of regions they previously held, and essentially they seem to have lost, at least in this war, and Ukraine is claiming that victory. So in terms of strategy, thinking of the president of Russia, what would you say may be at stake for him in this meeting?
Thank you, Coyote. I think it's very important to note that we are actually on day 200 plus, and in less than 5 months, the war will, go a full year. Perhaps, we may see some level of, peace resolution or not. But, you're very correct in the sense that this meeting between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Chinese president, it's quite, significant in the sense that it does demonstrate, to the minimum that, Russia still has friends like China that are ready to engage, at least, if not, directly support Russia, in this war. And as you said, this comes at the backdrop of Russia, losing some of the Kharkiv territory to the Ukrainian forces. But we have to be very clear that there is a lot of propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation that has, been, going on, during this war. Just by losing one territory, which is a battle, doesn't necessarily mean that this cannot be recaptured, by Russian forces. As you rightly said, Russia continues to fight for this territory. It does occupy more than 20% of Ukrainian territory thus far. So for Ukraine to then, retake about 8,000 square kilometers, of land as they claim that they have, it's a significant victory for Ukraine. But of course, the fighting still goes on. There's still shelling, as you rightly mentioned, by the Russian forces. So we cannot, at this point in time, be very certain as to where the battleground is shifting towards. I think we still have to keep our fingers crossed. But, to answer your question directly, I think it's a quite significant meeting between Putin and his Chinese counterpart.
UN Secretary General, it appears that it is certain that this war will at least stretch into next week's International Day of Peace. And I keep referring to that because that's the irony of all of this. And I mean, the UN essentially was formed to keep the peace across nations of the world such that we don't see a war yet again. But we're now celebrating or commemorating an International Day of Peace right in the middle of a war between Russia and Ukraine. We've also seen some other attacks in other parts of the world in recent times. Is there really a role for the United Nations still? Yes, it's 204 days, but maybe is there still a role for the UN in this war, trying to come to a resolution for the parties?
Kayode, it will be very challenging for the UN to, sit down and kind of celebrate an International Day of Peace, when, of course, we still have the ongoing war in Ukraine, which, was invaded by Russia. Of course, you rightly mentioned there's still the war in Ethiopia as well between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray Defense Forces. It's not just those two countries, but there is a lot of challenges that the UN, has been facing in terms of its role as a peacekeeping, international organization. At this point in time, it will be very difficult for the UN to, kind of, immerse itself into some kind of a peaceful end to the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. What the UN has been focusing on, as you may know, is that they've been focusing on the humanitarian aspect, getting, some, passages for grains to be exported out of Ukraine, but, again, there was some level of ceasefire in other countries like Ethiopia. But, that has not translated to any meaningful peace, which is a very challenging aspect for the United Nations to look at and think about what its role is. Perhaps, to review its position, as an organization that is meant to bring, peace and security in the world. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't think we are anywhere close to any peaceful resolution between Russia and Ukraine. Russia has insisted and continues to fight to keep the territories that it has occupied. But of course, it struggles to do that because, it's one thing to invade a country. It's one thing to somehow control the territory. But, when it comes to, maintaining law and order and actually governing that territory, that is where it will become very challenging, especially with the fact that Ukraine has vowed to recapture all its territories, of course, with the help of the United States and other Western countries. But for the UN, I think, the UN is still in a very challenging position, when it comes to maintaining peace and order in the world.
Oh dear. But we've seen some sort of, maybe silver lining, you might call it that, this truce between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We saw major attacks recently, killing over 100, but it looks like they have come to a truce after just, a few days. So it looks like peace indeed is possible, really. We don't know how long this will hold for and if this will last, forever. But clearly, I think there's a lesson to learn from the Armenia-Azerbaijan situation, that at least some sort of compromise, truce is possible. If you were to weigh both Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia, Ukraine, clearly different, but just how different are they? Is there anything to learn from what's playing out between Armenia and Azerbaijan, such that we can bring that to bear with the Ukraine-Russia war?
I think that's always the very, difficult position, to always think that, because you've succeeded to resolve or to some kind of obtain some level of truce between one conflict, i.e. the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, then you would, repeat the same, situation in the case of Russia and Ukraine, or perhaps, Ethiopia and the Tigray region, whichever conflict you're looking at. Each conflict has its own DNA, and therefore each party has, what they're looking for. They have this strategic objective. And what happened in Armenia and Azerbaijan is very, very different from what is happening between Ukraine and Russia. And the behavior of the parties is also very key. Russia, is bent on ensuring that, it keeps Ukraine away from any links to becoming a NATO member, as it is said. It wants to see some level of, the Ukrainian government change, as it calls it, some denazification. On the other side, Ukraine wants to make sure that it does take away all its territories, including the Crimea region that was, annexed by Russia in 2014. So these are very exclusive positions, between Russia and Ukraine. And therefore, finding a common ground, has become very challenging as opposed to the Azerbaijan-Armenia situation. So we must be, optimistic that even if we see some silver lining in the case of Azerbaijan and Armenia, it's very difficult to then think that the same will happen between Russia and Ukraine. Because as clearly as we've seen, all efforts, or some of the key efforts, to bring some level of peace has not worked this far.
Right. On a final note, looks like Russia might not be showing some weakness on the outside. They still have that front that we're going to follow this through. But inside, at least in the country, we've seen dissenting voices. In fact, the recent one, the local Russian official who has doubled down on the call for President Putin to step down. Do you think that might be the weakness that probably would pull Russia out of this war?
I think what should be noted here is that, first of all, this war is exclusively being fought in the Ukrainian territory. Therefore, the battle side is not being felt, in Russia as much as it is being felt in Ukraine. Yes, there is a high level of disagreement. There are people in Russia who believe that, the Russian invasion is against international law, and of course, Russia shouldn't have done that. But there are also people in Russia who believe that it's the right thing to do for national peace and security, to protect Russia from, its NATO, allies or opponents, right, whichever language you prefer to use. There is an election that will be coming in, presidential election that will be coming in next year, and perhaps, that would have some level of influence. People will be able to express whether they see the current regime of Vladimir Putin as taking Russia towards the right direction. Mind
Right.
you, Russia has been, hit by multiple sanctions, but it does seem to, have come up with a way to deal with these sanctions. Especially, I think Russia is perhaps holding on, to see how this winter, would look like, because of course the supply of energy, it is strength, and Russia talks about, imposing countries to buy energy using the Russian ruble, just as a way to counter some of the sanctions.
Clearly
so,
very...
Russia still has, one or two things, to deal with, but all is not lost. Let's see how it goes.
Well, I guess we could just anchor at that point. Let's see how it goes and hope for the best, as our previous guest said. David Otto, Director for Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies, thank you so much for your time on the program this morning.
Thank you.
Well, still to come on the program, Zelensky visits retaking Balaklia Awards servicemen in cellar. Stay with us. Welcome back. Ankara has requested explanations from Ukraine over what Turkish media described as a campaign calling for sanctions against Turkish companies. The Foreign Minister, Mevlut Cavusoglu, has said Turkish diplomats took steps to clarify the situation both in Kyiv and Ankara. Well, Cavusoglu confirmed that Turkey is aware of an extensive Ukrainian campaign targeting not just Turkish companies, but over 18,000 individuals and entities from various parts of the world, including the US and the EU, over their supposed ties with Russia. The foreign minister's comments came one day after Turkish newspaper Aydınlık drew attention to a website apparently affiliated with the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs that lists individuals and entities it wants sanctioned over the alleged dealings with Russia. Also, business now. The European Union's executive plans to raise more than 140 billion euros, that's about $140 billion, to shield consumers from soaring energy prices by skimming off revenues from low-cost electricity generators and making fossil fuel firms share windfall profits. Well, to ease the increased pressure this puts on European households and businesses, the Commission is now taking the next step in tackling this issue by proposing exceptional electricity demand reduction measures, which will help, according to them, reduce the cost of electricity for consumers, and measures to redistribute the energy sector's surplus revenues to final customers. Well, John McQuay is here to help us understand this. Yes, we all understand the energy conversation. We all need energy. Charge your mobile phones, watch television, watch channels television, to be particular. But what is this all about, really?
So we know that because of what's going on, of course, Russia has finally, as Ladi would like to put it, maintenance of their Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Yeah. But we know that what it means is Russia has not been supplying gas to Europe for electricity, so they've had to be working with storage and look for other alternatives. So, of course, even before now, since they said they were going to wean themselves off Russian gas, we've seen soaring energy prices in Europe. So what this means that the new reality is that nothing is coming from Russia. At first, they went from about 40% to 20% and now to 0%. So that means they don't have a source, so they're seeking to get alternative. Meanwhile, they have to manage what they have. So one of the ways they want to manage is to raise that money, 140 billion euros. Now, you know, the first story here is we say 140 billion euros, and it's almost as the same thing as 140 billion dollars. It never used to be like that. Euro used to be way higher than that. So these are part of the impacts, you know, because soaring energy prices brings inflation and brings devaluation of the currency. The purchasing power reduces and stuff like that. So they are just trying to find a way to help the people, try to reduce the impact on the people, and the people who may have to pay for that are the people who deal in fossil fuel, because people who deal in oil and gas related products are making a lot of money now, because our oil prices is going up because of all of this. So that's what they're doing in the UK too. They're doing that in the United States. No, the UK, the new Prime Minister is not in with it.
Just yet.
Yes, she doesn't want to align with that. So they want to go to windfall tax. That means people who are making excess money at this time from fossil fuel,
right,
they will have to supply this money that they will use to buffer. And they will also have to cut their demand. So you're more conscious of when you put on the electricity, when you put on your bulb, when you go to work, and they want to cut it by 10%, you know, at the peak hours.
Well, you know, if people do want to do this for the environment, at least as a result of the war, people will do this eventually. The coming days will be very interesting, especially for winter.
Yes.
But quickly, talk to us about this India economic growth downgrade.
Yeah.
What's going on?
The forecast was that they will grow by 7.8% this year, but now it's been cut to 7%. Because of the same thing. I mean, the inflation figure is really high everywhere. Nobody can be shielded. No economy is shielded because it's a global world.
Yeah.
So if everybody goes to one market and now the supply is minus Russia, it means there's more demand than supply. So prices soar, and that translates to higher inflation in your country, and it translates to less purchasing power for your currency. So it's the same thing for India. Their forecast is not as big, even though they're buying cheap oil from Russia. Their growth. Time is never
You win some, you lose some. Well, I'm looking at my time. We're going to join you in 8 minutes for a more comprehensive package on Business Morning. Thank you so much,
Thank you so much,
for that update. Let's talk sports now. Shakhtar Donetsk head coach is proud of the team's performance following a 1-1 draw against Celtics in Warsaw in their second group game of the UEFA Champions League. Jovicevic admits the match was a difficult one and praised Celtics' current squad for being the best in the last 20 years. He said the aggressive pressing did not allow his team to recover from their breath despite the team's preparedness for such an onslaught. A dominant first half saw Ange Postecoglou's side take the lead courtesy of an own goal from Artem Bondarenko. But Mikhailo Mudry's impressive campaign continued as he netted the equalizer for the Ukrainian club side. Well, Ivan Kulek's appeal against a one-year ban for wearing the pro-invasion of Ukraine's Z symbol has partially been upheld and will now run concurrent to Russian athletes being barred from International Gymnastics Federation competition. The Russian sported the Z symbol on his singlet at the FIG Pirates World Cup in Doha in March, a week after his country launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. While the one-year sanction remains, the Gymnastics Ethics Foundation Appeal Tribunal found it should be independent from measures preventing all Russian athletes competing in the event. Well, this means it began on May the 17th, the day the initial GEF Disciplinary Commission handed down the ban, and will last until May the 16th next year. Well, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has awarded servicemen during his visit to retaken northeast Ukrainian town of Balakleya yesterday. Mr. Zelensky wished health to all the servicemen and their families, saying that the people of Ukraine, the children, their children and grandchildren will never forget. Balakleya, which had a population of 27,000 before the war, is one of a chain of key urban outposts that Ukraine has recaptured over the last week after a sudden collapse of one of Russia's principal front lines. Mr. Zelensky said earlier this week that Ukraine had now recaptured roughly 6,000 square kilometers of territory, but he called on the West to speed up deliveries of weapons systems. And that's the program for this morning. Thank you for watching.